Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. As most of our generation lived through our first ever pandemic, many parallels are being drawn with history in terms of the lessons to draw from there and, of course, what the cause of the pandemics was. In his book, The Age of Pandemics and How They Shaped India and the World, Chinmay Tumbe, who's an author and a professor at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad, details and documents much of the facets of cholera, plague, and influenza pandemics that occurred between the period of 1817 to 1920 and claimed many million lives. What are the lessons to draw from there? And more importantly, what are the parallels both in terms of the undercounting of the dead and how long it took to draw out of this pandemic crisis? Joining me now to talk about all of that is the author himself, Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay, thank you for joining in and speaking with me. So much has happened in the last couple of months with regards to COVID. I've been looking at some of the literature that you've written, some of the articles as well that you've given, and I noticed somewhere where you made the point that this is not going away in a hurry. We need to be prepared for a 2-year window at this point in terms of how much longer it should go. Do you predicate that on what you're seeing right now, or the lessons that history has to tell, or is it a mix of both?
I think it's a mix of both, but I think what we do have, which we never had really in the past, is this weapon called the vaccine, which makes us more confident that this thing can be, ended sooner than we think. But if hypothetically there was no vaccine, this would have gone for many, many years. Because what we're seeing around the world is that the minute there's a unlocking of the economy, which is of course very important for livelihood, that's when the virus again, takes traction. So this is a kind of an endless cycle. And we've seen this before in history. We've seen this with plague, where plague devastated India for 20 every year. It was a seasonal disease. There were a few months of the year when it would just come and just ravage large parts of India. So pandemics usually do not end in a few months. Even the influenza pandemic of 1918 took about 2 years of toll. Though its major toll was in the second wave, it had a much a longer sort of lasting impact. So at the minimum, right now, when we are in May 2021, I think we need a forward planning for this pandemic of at least 2 years, not just 1 year. It's quite likely that after 2 years we realize that this was the peak and this was the end of it. But it's better to live now with this 2 year forward planning than not. So I think we need to take lessons of history in the sense that there are so many waves of pandemics in the past. Into our forward planning this year, and it is very unfortunate that we kind of think evidenceless triumphalism, which we saw in January and February, that the worst was behind us. Unfortunately, we've been completely knocked out in April and May this year, and hopefully this is the worst in terms of the carnage, in terms of cases, deaths, and hopefully the next wave, we don't see such numbers again.
It's interesting you say 2 years, Chinmay, because even on that, the solution, which is a vaccine, I think that's pretty much what this is panning out to be in terms of how long it's going to take to vaccinate a bulk of the population. I want to talk about so many things, including the economic impact that you alluded to, but I want to really go deep into this point about the deaths, Chinmay, and the undercounting that we're seeing at this point, because I was fascinated by the number of parallels there were between what you found when you documented your book versus what we're seeing right now. The first thing I wanted to ask you is what is the right measure to be applying when you're trying to understand what the level or the quantum of undercounting is that's underway at this point?
Yeah, I think they have broadly put two main methods. One is where we count deaths. So suppose we were in a system like many of our city corporations, we say as 100% registration, which means everyone who dies, virtually everyone who dies, gets a death certificate. Now, the minute you get a death certificate, there's a number in the system, right? And of course, if you add attributes saying cause of death is COVID-19, we get a count. That's what we are, living on today. That is when you're saying 3,500 COVID-19 deaths a day. That's based on this particular metric. Of course, a lot of people are dying, typically, especially in a pandemic, who will not report the disease as COVID-19 or the particular pandemic disease. But in the system, as long as the death certificate is registered, that's still, it's possible to get an estimate of how many people are dying from COVID-19. Because what you see in usual times is that there's very little variation, whether it's month to month or year to year, in death. Right? So it's very predictable. Suppose there was no COVID. If you see the trend line for the last 20 years, every year with some population growth, the number of deaths grows by a certain percentage. So it's only unusual events which kind of heighten these spikes. So say an earthquake in a region, suddenly you get a lot of deaths in those places. Now, so death certificates, or what you call as death registration, is the number one way to understand this, and it doesn't really matter. I want to emphasize this. It doesn't really matter if we record it as COVID-19 or not, as long as the monthly or weekly death registration system data is publicly available at every district level of India. It is possible to get an estimate of how many people are dead. And as this newspaper Divya Bhaskar has broken out the story in Gujarat, and the numbers are very shocking because it's showing you even a conservative undercounting factor of about 9 or 10, which means the actual deaths are not 4,000 COVID-19 deaths just in the second wave in Gujarat, but closer to 40,000. Now that's a huge, underreporting fact. So it is possible to get the underreporting scale even in real time as long as we have a handle on the death certificate. This leaves out, of course, people who are not registering. And in many states of India, like Bihar, UP, the death registration system itself is incomplete. So there's really nothing much you can do with death certificates and so on. You can do it in a state like Gujarat or Kerala where death registration is complete. So we rely on the second method, which is using the census. Now that is not in real time, so you have to wait for the census. The census has been delayed this year. So then what you can do is estimate the shortfalls, especially in particular age brackets, because we know COVID-19 is hitting the older people. So if you compare the cohort between 2011 and the next cohort, say in 2022 or 2023, whenever the census is computed, you can find out the shortfalls. And we are unfortunately going to find huge shortfalls, especially in Uttar Pradesh, using this method. I used this method to find the shortfall in the 1918 pandemic. The reported number then was 6 million. And if you look at 1911 to 1921 and take into account pre and post trend growth rate, my estimate is about 20 million. So 6 million reported deaths and 20 million estimates. So that was an underreporting factor of 3. And I would imagine that you would find lesser underreporting factors today. But from whatever limited work I'm doing on Gujarat, from the Divya Bhaskar, release numbers, it's striking that the underreporting factors are so much larger than what it was in 1918 when people are not really reporting deaths in a big way back then. So a lot of puzzles, but there's no doubt that we are underreporting deaths in a substantial scale. Of course, it will vary from state to state. It will vary from municipality to municipality. But my look at the numbers for Gujarat tells me that it is very, very large. And so if we are saying that about 270,000 people have died of COVID-19 as of today, cumulatively, since the start of the pandemic, that number is going to be way in excess of that. We'll find out eventually only when the census comes. Of course, before that, we'll have these death certificates. So death certificates and census, these are the two classic methods. Then you have obituaries, crematoriums, various other things the journalists on the ground are doing.
Is that what you tapped into when you were trying to track the difference that you saw in the influenza deaths? Chinmay, that's a huge gap, between what was reported versus what you found. And the reason I ask you this is because, when we look back at this moment in time, 10 years from now, what is it that we can depend on? There's been some or a lot of citizen documentation, as you said, journalists, not-for-profits, trying to put this together, especially in cases where entire families have wiped out. Then there is perhaps, not even the option of creating those death certificates. What did you tap into? And do you think citizen documentation is going to be sort of the holding base from where we can lift off in terms of what the numbers look like?
Absolutely. I have no doubt that obviously nobody's going to know precisely how many people die, but a factor of a difference of 10 is huge. Somebody's telling me had 300,000 COVID deaths versus, something like 1.5 to 3 million. That's a stunning, large difference. And I believe that we will eventually, zero down to a much more plausible number based on, as I said, death certificates, which the government has to, give out that data. Census when it comes. So even as you said, if an entire family is getting wiped out, that family will be wiped out for the census people, and so they will not be enumerated in the next census. And so again, using those age cohorts, you can find those gaps. And so, as I said, for 1918, it was very stark. When the Health Commissioner of 1918, Norman White, provided the 6 million figure in February 1919, The country was stunned, but it was kind of the ballpark figure of how many people used to die back then in famines and so on. They didn't know that it was actually 20 million. And even that, but that generation registered that particular event collectively as a 6 million figure, right? So I found letters to the editor in the 1950s reminding people about the 1918 pandemic, saying 6 million people died. But that number was not 6 million. It was the largest demographic shock ever received by any country in recorded history in a short period of time. And the first person who really detected this was a census official. He was a British officer. When he wrote the census report, I think in 1923 or 1921, he said that, look, there's something unusual happening. A large part of India has seen massive population decline. It's when the census officers went to these villages and found virtually a lot of depopulated villages that they realized the extent of it. And they were the first people to push up that number from 6 million to something closer to 11 to 12 million. And then since then, in the last 100 years, researchers have revised using various methods, taking the numbers up and up. And my latest work sort of takes into data of also the princely states like Hyderabad, Rajasthan, which were not counted back then because the census happened, but not the death counting. And I find that those places were also very badly hit, and that's why my numbers go now in excess of 20 million. And as I said, that makes it the world's largest shock. Now, interestingly, the freedom fighters, the politicians of that time, they were demanding accountability to end famine, but nobody really pushed hard enough on the influenza pandemic, partly because the death numbers were not so large in comparison with what other things we're seeing. And I'm seeing a very similar streak happening in the government response today in Gujarat. They've not disputed the numbers put out by Divya Bhaskar for 2021. They're saying, no, you can't take the correct, you need to take a correct reference here. And all these points are valid. But however you look at it, the underreporting factor is huge. And I see a lot of politicians saying, oh, people die in any ways in large numbers in India, so you can't really look at these numbers. I think we need to emphasize that this is a truly unique event in Indian history, probably obviously the most traumatic year since 1947. And the numbers are going to speak for themselves when they actually come out.
And when you say that, whatever happened during the influenza period was the biggest sort of system shock to a nation in terms of lives lost, would you say what we're living through at this point could actually exceed that?
Yeah, I don't think it's influenza. We're saying we lost 20 million lives. I don't think we're going to lose that many lives. But having said that, we would think that 100 years later, our technologies, let me put it this way. When the WHO declared this as a pandemic last year in March, I put a tweet thread on the influenza pandemic, which got a lot of traction. And a lot of comments on that tweet were saying, this was before, remember, we're saying March 12, 2020. Nobody really even knew the word pandemic in India. And people commented saying, this is never going to happen in India now, because you're talking about 1918, but we're in 2020. And, these things will quickly, the government will quickly react. But the point is, the pandemic has hit civilizations across centuries, and each civilization thought they were superior to other earlier ones. So this kind of idea that nothing can happen to us, or we got all the technology to solve. Yes, we have the vaccines, which were not there earlier, but we are still losing far too many people. And at the rate we're going, it's very plausible that we're going to lose more than 1 million lives by the end of this pandemic, which is probably the largest disaster we are seeing in peacetime, owing to one single kind of a shock, which is very, very tragic.
The other thing one did not imagine one would see in the times we live in, Chinmay, and you've said, that every death leaves a trace. I think we did not anticipate that we would see dead bodies in scores floating down a river. I think you've mentioned that, and you tweeted an excerpt as well. If you permit, I'd just like to read it out, saying, down in the plains, numberless bodies were thrown in the rivers of the province since there was insufficient firewood for the cremation of Hindus. The Ganga, lifeline of major civilizations, flowed with death in its midst. The Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister says this is not something that is uncommon in northern India. How do you rationalize what we're seeing at this point, 100 years later, seeing scores of these dead bodies flowing down the river?
Yeah, I mean, to the comment that it's not uncommon, yes, it's not uncommon to find dead bodies. It is uncommon to find 2,000 dead bodies, as reporters have, found out. And that's just a small tip of the iceberg, if you ask me. Let me just tell you, when I was writing this book last year, I did think, many things would play out exactly like it did in 1918, like the second wave, like the idea of confusion, and many of the things I've written in my book. But when I wrote that paragraph on dead bodies in the Ganga, I that was definitely one of the things I said, which should not, definitely happen in 2021. And again, there were many more deaths back then. But the fact is that when the newspaper headlines broke this story, I said to myself, this is crazy because we are literally reliving 1918 as if nothing has changed since then. So it's truly tragic, and the fact that this is happening clearly tells you the scale of the tragedy in places like Uttar Pradesh. Uh, Again, this, since we're talking about death, undercounting, and so on, all of these things are plausible to get some numbers, especially in urban India. But in rural India, it's very tough unless you have the census counting people. So when you have dead bodies floating on a river and so on, there's really almost it's almost impossible to tell who are these people, what circumstances led to this thing. But we can only say that a lot of this is because at that particular critical junction, UP, in the second half of April 2021, when you had massive waiting lines at crematoriums and so on, where people said, okay, to hell with religious rights, just let's get the body off, and that's what kind of led to this mass disposal. It kind of tells you the severity of the pandemic in second half of April out there. So it's a truly unfortunate incident, and I do think that obviously a pandemic, a lot of things are out of one's control, but in this particular case, this idea that we had kind of conquered, defeated COVID, which again I see politicians using this language. Now that the numbers are coming, reported numbers are coming down. We are defeating COVID. This idea that we are one step ahead of the pandemic. I think we have to. I end my book with these two traits that I think is useful to have in a pandemic, which is patience and humility. The idea that you need to take as much, do as much planning as you can, and try and be one step ahead of this pandemic to the best extent possible, but also be aware that these viruses can be quite deadly, and they have proved to be deadly for different civilizations across the last 2,000 odd years. And so that's why one has to be take this threat very seriously.
Some of those dead bodies could also be a function of complete lack of funds, right, Chinmay? I mean, in your book, you write of lack of firewood, but over here, it's perhaps lack of financial resources to do this any other way. The other thing that that struck me was the fact that you pointed out that mortality was higher in Western and Northern India. Um, you know, what were the sort of threads that you drew at that point, and are there parallels to look back in history and sort of analyze this in terms of what's happening in the northern part of India versus what's happening in perhaps the southern part of India right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that obviously people obsess about in a pandemic is regional variations, and all of us have obsessed in the last 1 year with this classic question: why is the US and the West so badly hit, and why is India? I mean, of course, we saw it as India, but if you look at the numbers, it's much of Asia, much of Africa, which was not hit. And of course, we all had our own hypothesis: the hygiene hypothesis, the fact that we grew up in unclean environments, makes us more immune. If you get a BCG vaccine at an early age, you're more immune. So tons of hypotheses. But of course, there are also people pointing out to the differences in age distribution. The fact that the West has that many, the much higher, the median age out there is much, almost 10 or 20 years more than Africa and Asia, means that obviously, even with the same rate, more people are going to die out there because they have a higher fraction of people in the old age. So there were many, hypotheses. But the thing about a pandemic is that often you get to know why some people are dying in some places and not others many years after the pandemic, when we understood transmission, when we understood the reasons behind the pandemic much more fully. And that's why I argue that one should not over speculate, these reasons during a pandemic. So what we do know now, of course, is that within India, of course, there is some sort of variation. But what we're seeing in the second wave is that incidence, just like in 1918, the incidence has been uniform, which means it has swept through everywhere. But we are seeing mortality crisis, the hunt for oxygen cylinders in a few places. And that's why there's a very close parallel to what happened in 1918. Because what I'm arguing is that 20 million people need not have died in 1918. The fact that, and the first person to really point this out was a person called Ian Mills in 1986. And he pointed a very crucial thing. He said, it is true that Western and Northern India had much more death rates than Southern and Eastern India in 1918. But he said, if you look at the data on jails, where you had data on not only death, but also cases, that is how many people got infected by influenza. He says that was uniform, which means you were as likely to contract influenza in a jail in Assam or in Madras or in Delhi or in Bombay as anywhere else. But you were much more likely to die of influenza in Delhi, in Bombay, and so on. So this was a puzzle. And he blamed it on temperature. He said in 1918 it was much colder because it happened between September and December. He said it was much colder in Western and Northern India than Southern and Eastern India. And that's why people, influenza hit the lungs very hard. It caused pneumonia, and that's why a lot of people died. And I'm arguing that that's not the reason because it doesn't explain the cross-country variation mortality. I'm arguing that it was actually nutrition and food. That is, it so happened that in 1918 we also got knocked out by the third worst recorded drought in our history. As a result of which food prices went through the roof, and food prices went up through the roof only in Western and Northern India. In fact, food prices were declining in Eastern India. And at that time, the railways typically, sorts out food prices across the country. It takes, food grain surplus to places which are having food grain deficiencies. But the railways was then pressed into exporting food, in fact, for the war effort, because this is in the context of World War I. So it was essentially food grain, I would say, inefficient supply of food grain management, which, aggravated the problem whereby people who could have tided over influenza with some amount of basic nutrition in their body could not. And all the accounts of, first-hand accounts is that people, when they were given some amount of milk, food, etc., they could survive the tide. Right? Now, so basically the argument is that influenza created disproportionate mortality in some parts of India because of the drought and, of course, inefficient food supply management. And the close parallel today is not food, because we are sitting on record grains of food stocks. Where in fact I think it's a bumper year for food grain exports. But the critical resource today is not food but oxygen, right? And obviously now it's the same situation. Oxygen and vaccine, I would say, right? So oxygen, if you have the vaccine, you're much less likely to die, and if you have the oxygen, you're much less likely to die. And again, the parallel with 1918 is chilling, because the British were that time exporting food grain for the war support, and we were exporting vaccines for vaccine diplomacy. So on the vaccine front, clearly, some at least a few more people would have been protected if we had focused on ourselves. On oxygen, of course, we should have planned better. And states which did not have oxygen generating capacity, classically Delhi, which did not capacity produce, they were already caught out because they were then dependent on supplies coming from other places. Which, for example, Bombay was not so much because they had access to places in Maharashtra. So it's the differential kind of access to oxygen supplies which mattered critically in this period, say from April 15th to May 10th. And again, a classic kind of comparison from 1918. Back then it was food, this time it's vaccines and oxygen. And that's why, that kind of explains why some parts, I think, were much more hit than others. Because if you look at case incidence rates, I think by the end of this pandemic, you're going to find that it was pretty uniform across the country. I mean, you saw states which were last hit, like now in West Bengal, in Assam, and Tamil Nadu. These were the last states which went into the lockdown, and they're now being hit quite badly. Right? So it's almost as if every state is going through what Maharashtra went through between March 15th and April 15th. It's just like with a 1 month lag, literally everywhere else. And I think the value of the lockdown or restrictions, whatever you want to call it, is very important. Whatever one thinks of it in the first year, I think they're proving to be fairly valuable this year in slowing down transmission and breaking transmission. But the key is, of course, now what do we do, going forward? We have to unlock, and that's why the end game. I'm not going to use the word end game, but the way it's going to recede is really through the vaccination program, and that's why all the focus is now going to be on the vaccination program.
Yeah, no,
which was not there in 1918.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Chinmay. In fact, having spoken with some of the private hospital heads, they've made the point that the per human use of the units of oxygen is actually, for some reason, much higher in the northern part of India than it has been in the western. So great point to have made. There's two other areas I want to cover with you. One is how the attitude towards the government changed, if it did, the colonial government, and the other is vaccine hesitancy. So let's take the response to the colonial government first, especially with regards to plague, where it seemed that because the government was clamping down harder in terms of public health or general hygiene and sanitation, a lot of mistrust arose. Any parallels to draw in terms of how a government's response, particularly in times of acute crises like a pandemic, can really change or turn public opinion or can really make a lasting impact?
Yeah, I think we saw this last year. I think the last year's example of the national lockdown with very little prior notice and the migration crisis, I think that was similar to the scenes that one saw during plague in terms of extreme surveillance. Of course, the parallel is that we're using the same law. The Epidemic Disease Act comes from 1897, which started during the plague. So definitely, mask. Of course, you do need to take restrictions. You need to enforce restrictions. But we've seen these visuals of police people unfortunately beating up street vendors. Similar scenes played out back in the plague. The disproportionate impact of those harsh measures are taken by the poor, right? And so that is the closest parallel that I would say is, the lies between what happened back then during the plague in particular and influenza. What's interesting, of course, what changes. In the plague, they start off very harsh. After 15 years, their plague policy manual starts off with this line which says, you will not achieve any success until you take into account the confidence of the people. And they realize that whatever we suggest, use disinfectants, whatever public health protocols we do, nothing is going to work if the people don't trust you, right? And so that's the real learning that the British officials themselves kind of took into place, saying that okay, they're going to criticize us, we'll take some criticism, but the fact is that we have to be responsive to what these people are saying, because we can't just say okay, I mean, they were saying that patients have to be segregated from their families at hospitals. Now, in Indian tradition, this was virtually impossible, and this led to riots and so on. And then they realized that maybe this is, we can tweak these rules to not make it so harsh. So basically, the British experimented and they learned, and they realized that you have to take into confidence of people. So I think that's a key cornerstone of any successful public health policy. I think last year, on one hand, when the prime minister announced the speeches and so on, I think there was a period where people did, prime minister is a fantastic orator, so people got this message that we have to take certain precautions and so on. But I think on the flip side, we also saw this thing about, extreme sort of coercion and surveillance coming to suspend economic activities, which are very, very stark. So I think this applies more to last year. This year, in fact, the reaction has been virtually diametrically opposite. It's saying that state governments can do what they want. The center is definitely not going to step in. So it's each state government fending for themselves this year. And in that sense, everyone's realized, I think the learning from last year is we've not seen the visuals yet, thankfully, of the migration crisis that we saw last year. And so if anything, that's the learning from what we've seen last year.
The other sort of learning at that point in time, Chinmay, was, as you said, segregation, isolation, and then they figured that this is not working. Ultimately, inoculation is what will work. But because there was that sense of mistrust, vaccine hesitancy was very high, at that point in time. And here we are all these years later, where vaccine hesitancy is again quite high. I mean, availability is of course a problem, but if you talk to people in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, this is what villagers tell each other: वो टीका लगाएंगे तो बुखार हो जाएगा, मर जाएंगे, मत लगाइएगा. How did they come around it, and how do you think we're going to be able to circumvent this, or even sort of just move through this?
Yeah, I think the key, if you see, vaccine hesitancy around the world, even in the US today. If you talk to any public health officials, they'll tell you that it takes a lot of effort. It's not something simple that say, okay, we have got the vaccine, now come to the center. Nobody's going to come. So you have to have community outreach. The key, so I see the history correctly, the key is to demonstrate the value and the utility of it. And this is what happened during the plague. Of course, the plague had a particular setback. There was a particular scandal involving some bottles broke and some people died of tetanus. So there's a particular kind of a scandal which also affected the drive. But what's interesting is, and I'll quote this annual report of the Haskell Institute of 1931, where they said that where there was first vaccine hesitancy, I mean, this is just to paraphrase them, where there was first a riot where if you pressed for inoculation, there was a riot. Now there's a riot if the vaccine supplies run out. And so that is a kind of change of mindset which happened between 1900 and 1930, because people started seeing the value of it. Now the challenge for us is to do this within 1 year, or literally within a few months, and not take 30 years to change mindsets on this. And so we need to kind of put out the numbers saying that, look, and the numbers are come filtering through, that the people who are getting hospitalized, the people who are dying, are much less likely if they're getting vaccinated. And this is the kind of public messaging that has to go out. There has to be strong demonstration effects, which means if you're asking me, who should take the shot, it's the sarpanch leaders who should be taking the shot in the villages. If you see the sarpanch, if you see the MLA taking the shot, it's got a huge demonstration effect. And that is why, politicians, actors, whoever can influence people, they have to, I think they should be taking the shot and putting up a photograph on their social media handles, or, on their WhatsApp handles, saying that, look, I've taken this shot, now you please take it, and it's very bad. So this is essentially a advertising kind of mechanism of reducing vaccine hesitancy. And I think it will. I think people will see the value of it because simply put, the vaccine hesitancy we saw in January, like the Hapkin Institute says, is going to very quickly switch because now people are affected. They know they've seen people die around them. In January, this was not the case. So people would think, if I don't take the vaccine, what's the harm? It's not going to change my life in any way. But now people know that, look, this COVID thing is real. We've seen families disappear in front of our eyes. And so if there's a chance of surviving this, I'm going to take it. And so I think vaccine hesitancy is automatically going to reduce unfortunately, because of the second wave. But we need to do much more on community outreach to kind of emphasize the message on why the vaccine is so important, and that if I think the way to message is if we get everyone vaccinated, we are much more likely to return back to life as normal than before. So this is what the UK has communicated to the population. I think they just lifted their lockdown, the 4-month lockdown today, after vaccinating a huge part of the population. Because it's only after you vaccinate a huge part of the population can you even think of going back to life as normal. So the messaging has to be in terms of preventing death, but also going back to life as normal, which means your incomes will go up, right? And so that messaging has to be carefully structured.
Yeah, very sad though that it's happening in a country like India, Chinmay, which so successfully carried out the polio inoculation. I mean, I think we're
Yeah.
leading example for what we can do when we really put our minds together. One final question to you on one doesn't think that one would start looking at these correlations, but death and economic contraction. Have you had a look at that data? What does it suggest, and what does it point to? Because
Sure.
ultimately, it will boil down to that as well, right? Economic lives coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the economic contraction, of course, more closely linked to the lockdown rather than death, because in influenza, the deaths also mattered for economic contraction because, simply put, if so many people disappear, then your workforce is reduced, and so you're going to be able to produce that much lesser. So that's the relationship from death to economic activity. So that was with 20 million deaths. Now, even if we take a ballpark figure of 1 million deaths as a percentage of overall Indian labor force, that's going to be minuscule. So, in a sense, the deaths are not going to, impact the economic activity in a very direct way. The lockdowns have a much more direct impact on economic activity. Having said that, because the deaths are so regionally distributed, in those places where you've seen a lot of mortality, like certain cities in Gujarat, I think Uttar Pradesh, you are going to see some economic knockout. And my guess is that it's the pressure, you're going to see the pressure not so much on activity, that is output, but on price. This is what happened in influenza. That is, 1918 was the biggest supply shock ever in Indian history, where you had output contraction of 10% and inflation surging at about 30% per annum. Right. So that was because people simply was too sick or too, they were simply dead, and so the farm output collapsed. Now, I don't think we are in that context today. As I said, we're sitting on record food grain stocks. I don't think agriculture is going to be that affected, even if this kind of the COVID sweeps through rural base. But the supply chain disruptions with both lockdowns and death, because the death also affects by people in the family being affected. People are not going to go to work for a few days. So everyone, so you can think, even if there are 1 million deaths, so many people affected by those deaths because it's close to them. If somebody in my immediate family dies, I'm not going to be in a mental state to work for the next 15 days, 1 month, maybe 2 months. So there's a knock-on effect, and I think that knock-on effect you'll start seeing in prices. So it's quite likely that the pressure you'll see because both of the lockdown and the death, but maybe not so much on output.
And of course, on household incomes, perhaps because of the sort of
Yeah.
monumental costs that people have had to incur with this health crisis.
Yeah, and especially when household member earning breadwinners are dying, that's going to be very chaotic. But unfortunately, last year I said this is the most traumatic year in history because of the migration and the income fall. Per capita income fell by almost 8-10%. But unfortunately, this year is even more traumatic because of the actual number of deaths. And so it's a bit ironic since this is also on the economy that the kind of two best years in terms of GDP growth rates, if you're sitting in 2030 and you look back at the last 30 years, you'll find that the best GDP growth rates came about in 2016-17, the year of demonetization. That's because the informal sector economy didn't get picked up in those growth rate numbers. And 2021, this particular year, 21-22, is going to see 7% plus growth rates purely on account of a base effect.
Yeah.
Right. So the two very traumatic years of our lives, demonetization and 2021, are going to see some of the best economic growth rates in our economic history. One, because of not capturing the informal economy, and two, because of a base effect. So it's truly ironic that how you see GDP growth rate numbers in the future when you're looking back, a person who's not lived through this era will say, oh wow, 2021 was a great year, you 7% growth. But that happened because of a minus 10% contraction, or close to minus 10% contraction. So I think we have to be also very careful in conveying what these economic growth numbers really mean, and it's kind of dissonance right now with the reality of the trauma.
Just like asset classes as well, right? This will go down as phenomenal
Absolutely.
for the stock market, but not for anyone else, I think. Completely
Yeah.
fascinating. Please,
Yeah, I actually teach a course called Pandemics now at the management school I work in. And interestingly, we have sessions on pandemics and financial markets, finance and macroeconomics. And so we discuss some of these concerns as what is the connection between the real street and the financial street and so on. But it's interesting because these are mostly MBA students, and they have such amazing questions, and they come up with very interesting things about how to do. I mean, we had this course in January, and I have student assignments which I now look back, and they had these frameworks, probability of second wave, scenario planning, probability of second wave, vaccine penetration, and they had all these charts. And I'm thinking, if only people had actually used some of these frameworks at a policy making level, because I think generally the probability of second wave was just put at practically zero. It looks like in February and even early March, which was very unfortunate.
we need more of these kids in the system, Chinmay. We need them to be doing the good stuff that they're doing in your classroom. Thank you so much for this chat. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for this walk down history and this contemporary class as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me over.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.